Back. So today we're talking about Kant. We spoke about Kant before, sort of Rachel's reading of what Kant's up to, which is, very much same as what Kant's up to. But when you read the actual work by Kant, you'll find that there's lots of room for interpretation because although he's a very deep thinker and in many ways very convincing, there's also a fair amount of ambiguity or difficulty in interpreting Kant. We'll talk about Kant, and then later in the week I'll post a lecture on the article by Korsgaard where she really digs into there's you see a modern scholar trying to interpret. So the selection that we read from Kant was from Metaphysics of Morals, and he approaches it in a slightly different way from Rachel's, and he talks about uh, our everyday sort of talk about morality or discussion of morality, which I think in modern terms we would call applied ethics, has a great deal of what he calls empirical content, right? So what he means by empirical content, empirical in philosophy language just means coming through the senses, right? So, science is sort of an empirical field of inquiry because it deals with the sensory world and the objects we see around us. Sort of the contrast with the empirical would be the rational, right? Sort of the world of pure reason. That would be the world of mathematics and logic and some kinds of philosophy. So, everyday moral decisions, sort of applied ethics, deals with empirical content and deals with, actual people. Is it right or wrong for this person to have an abortion, right? Very concrete things that we can see and hear and touch. Um, but there's something special about morality for Kant that is not just empirical, about specific people and specific occasions. He also thinks that a truly moral law is something that should apply to everyone equally. And I think intuitively that makes sense, right? We shouldn't say that, one thing is okay for Nate, but it's not okay for one of you, right? We think, no, we're all in some way should be treated equally, right? By moral law. He notes a parallel, right, with other laws that operate this way. Laws of mathematics operate this way, right? They're just true for all time and for all people, right? It's not that 2 + 2 = 4 for me and it equals 5 for you, right? Um, Similarly with the laws of logic, right? So if there's like, the law of non-contradiction, right? Or it can't be true that, proposition P and proposition not P are true at the same time, right? It can't be true that Nate is taller than 5'10" and also that Nate is shorter than 5'10" at the same time. So laws of logic, right, laws of mathematics, laws of morality are all similar in this way. They apply to everyone for all time. So this suggests, and I don't personally detect anything more than this sort of analogy, right, that Kant presents. It would be nice if he had a more convincing argument, but he says, yeah, moral laws just are rational laws, right, because they kind of look like rational laws. They apply to everyone all the time. Now, if that's true, right, if you accept that inference, which, as I've indicated, I'm not 100% sure that he gives us enough reason to accept that inference. But if you do accept that inference, um, then it would seem that we could discover moral laws purely rationally, just like we can discover the rules of mathematics, right? By doing proofs. We don't have to go out in the world and find sets of twos, add them to other sets of twos, and see, like, it looks like whenever we add a set of two things to another set of two things, we get four, right? Empirically, it must be the case that 2 + 2 = 4. That's not how math works, right? That's not how logic works. And Kant is suggesting that's not how morality works either. We can investigate it purely using reason. We don't need all the empirical content. So he now sort of jumps to another subject. So Kant jumps around a little bit, and as we see, it's a little bit difficult to find his argument, but everything he says is plausible and in some ways, deeply interesting, right? So he moves on to the idea that the only thing in the world that it can be truly said to be morally good is a good will. We can compare this with the utilitarian. What does the utilitarian say is the type of thing that can be good or bad? An action, right? So Kant is taking a completely different approach than the utilitarian. No, no, no. It's a goodwill. It's a person's intention, right? You might say. Uh, Remember, the utilitarian says intentions don't matter. It's only consequences. Kant is taking the opposite approach, saying it's only intentions that matter. And there's something about that that's deeply attractive to us, right? We want to say that if I'm trying to do the right thing, if I'm trying to help you, right, by lending you $5 when you ask me for it, um, if you use that $5 to buy whatever, a poison, a sandwich that gives you food poisoning and you die, I want to say that, well, my intentions were good. I didn't do a bad thing. You can't lock me up or, prosecute me for murder or mental manslaughter or something like that. Where our brains, I think, are sort of divided between the two. We do think consequences matter a lot, but we also think intentions matter. Kant is entirely on the side of intentions. And here's a bit of his, I don't think you need to be convinced of that. I think it's a deeply natural thing, but nonetheless, he gives us a bit of an argument for the idea that the only thing that is good in itself is a good will. He says, look, there's lots of other things out there that are good. Intelligence is a good thing, right? You know, talent at playing guitar or painting pictures or talent at philosophy. These are all good things, but they're only good if they're employed by goodwill. Otherwise, they become evil, right? So, power, money, strength, intelligence, all these things, if they are employed by a bad person, right, to do bad things, then they're bad, right? That's the concept of an evil supervillain, right? Which is, I don't know if people know this movie anymore, um, this Mike Myers movie, but this is a sort of a comic supervillain, right? Super intelligent, but using it for evil. And so when intelligence is used by a bad will, it's bad. When it's used by a good will, it's good. Kant says even happiness, right, which the utilitarian would say is always good, right? The utilitarian would say even Hitler's pleasure is counts as good, right? Kant says no. He says if happiness for a bad person is a bad thing, right? It's all about the will. It's all about the intention behind it, the person behind it, right? He goes on to list more good things, right? So we'll talk about Aristotle a bit later in the class, but Aristotle talks about various virtues that people could have, being a moderate person, being cool and not too angry, but not too um, going, uh, and even these Aristotelian virtues, Kant says if they're used for evil, then they're bad, right? So you could have a cool, very careful, very intelligent supervillain, and those are bad things when they're employed by someone with a bad will. And furthermore, consequences don't matter at all for Kant. Acting with good intentions, but the consequences are bad, you've still done a good thing. It's only the will, only the intention, the goodwill. Clear enough, I think, at this point. Now, Kant admits it might seem strange to you to say that only the will alone is good, right? Regardless of any of the concrete applications or consequences, right? Could goodness really be that abstract, really rational thing? And Kant says, well, look at it this way. Here's another sort of argument for the idea that morality is purely abstract, purely rational, and only about the goodwill. He says, let's suppose for the moment that the utilitarian is right, and happiness or some other sort of very concrete goal like that is the whole point of human action. Right? That's suppose the utilitarian is right, is that pain and pleasure are the ultimate good, the ultimate goals. Right? Kant says then, if that were the case, we wouldn't need these special rational brains at all. Right? Instinct alone is sufficient to make us happy. Right? Again, it's a kind of a version of the swine objection, but an interesting sort of uh, tweak on it, right? If you remember the swine objection, which said if utilitarianism is true, then like uh, pigs are perfectly moral beings too. So Kant's not saying that exactly, but he's saying if pleasure or happiness is the only goal of our action, why do we even have these brains, right? What good are they? We might as well just be dogs or pigs. We'd be perfectly, that's also perfectly good to pursue the only value in life, right? We would only need instinct. Um, So he thinks the fact that we have rationality, right, uh, indicates that there's some other purpose, right? That we don't have reason by accident, and it must be because our ultimate goals, right, of our pursuits are essentially rational, right? And the purpose of reason is to guide us to what the correct intentions are, like what is a good will. You need this special brain that we have in order to figure that out. to then guide your actions. So, what is a good will? What makes a will a good one? So here is his definition that will require a little unpacking, right? But he says a good will is one that directs action in accordance with duty. So what does he mean by a duty, right? A duty are the things you must do. In other words, moral laws, right, are duties. Now, we've noted before what's special about the moral laws as opposed to, other sorts of laws is that they apply to everyone all the time, right? So a moral law is a duty, imposes a duty on every single person. Now, just to clarify what we mean by duty here, um, sometimes you do your duty, but sort of by accident, right? So moral law imposes certain things that you must do, right? But doing that thing is not necessarily good. It's not necessarily moral unless you also do it because it's your duty, right? Again, it's your intention, it's your will in the action. It's the reason you did the thing is what makes it good or bad. So to make it less abstract and give you an example, suppose you own a store and you charge you charge fair prices, right? Um, a lot, it seemed like, post COVID, there's been a lot of inflation, and it seems like some of it is just a little bit of price gouging, right? People have realized, oh, I can charge more, even though I don't need to, right? And people will pay it. Well, suppose you're not like that, right? Suppose you have a store and you charge very fair prices, right? You make a profit, but not a huge one, and you get by, and you think that's the right thing to do, right? Um, but what? So you could have two different stores, right, that are each charging the same fair price, but they might be doing it for different reasons, right? One person might be doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. Another person might be doing it because it gets them the most customers and it ends up being the most effective business strategy, right, to get them the most profit. Well, if you're doing it to get the most profit, it's not a moral act, right? It didn't come from a goodwill. If you're doing it because you think it's the right thing, it's the fair thing, then it's moral, right? So again, the action itself for Kant, I can't say whether it's moral or not. I need to look in the person's heart and their mind and see what was their intention. Right? Is it coming from a goodwill? Another example he gives, which is a little weirder, but as we'll see, right, as you any ethical theory, as you pursue it further and further, you get some situations that seem a little weird. But right, Kant also says, here's another example. Suppose that you hate your life for whatever reason. Maybe you're in incredible pain, or you're just very depressed, or you just hate everything about how it came out, or you detest humanity. Whatever it is, right? You wish you were dead more than anything. You don't want to go on living. And Kant says, if you nevertheless continue to live and don't commit suicide because you know you have a duty to preserve life, he says, you're acting morally, right? If basically, if you're getting no benefit whatsoever, no pleasure, no happiness, no good consequences, but nonetheless you're doing the right thing because rationally you've figured out that it's the right thing, he says that's how you know, like for sure, right? That's the clearest example of moral action is when you're acting purely from a goodwill and there's no good consequences whatsoever. Okay, so to summarize, right, the only thing that's good in itself is a good will. What's the good will? It's the one that does its duty, right? It's one that acts in accordance with duty. So again, and he's sort of clarified, right, the difference between acting out of duty and acting out of because, it causes good consequences for you, right? Acting out of your duty is purely um, forced from any consequences. So, but we still need to know what is our duty, right? How do we know what our duty is? What is the moral law? Again, they're not determined by the consequences, right? Instead, they're determined by the principle, the reason that you're using to do the thing, right? He calls this the maxim on which you're based, which you'd be familiar with this from, right? Again, your intentions are governed by reason, right? This is the special thing that humans have, right? That pigs and dogs don't have. Reason are the abstract laws of logic, right? I don't know if any of you have taken logic, right? But here's a list of some of the laws of logic, right? Law of identity, double negation, non-contradiction, and so on. So for Kant, right, he throws around some similar terms: principle, maxim, law. For him, they all mean the same thing, right? So the only good thing is the will. The will, the good will is the one that follows its duty, right? That acts in accordance with duty. And there is some maxim or law or rule that determines our duty. So what is the rule? What is the principle that determines our duty? This is the categorical imperative, which hopefully should be familiar at this point, right? Um, Different ways it's formulated. Here's one. I am never to act otherwise than so I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. So he thinks this is the most basic principle that tells us what our duty is, right? And it basically captures the essence of morality in that morality is, like logic, totally general, applies to everyone all the time. And so this, he thinks, is the connection between morality and rationality, right? A moral law is one that can be totally universal. If I do something and I ask myself, well, what's the rule that I'm following? And if I can make that rule apply to everyone without contradiction, it's a moral rule. Right? So moral laws are just the most universal laws that we could say everyone could follow all the time without contradiction. And so this example should be familiar, but I'm going to run it again. Prom- I promised a friend that I'm going to help her move, right? Now the day comes, right? I promised her last month. Now it's a month later. I'm like, oof, I do not feel like helping this person move. I'm really tired. I'm a little hungover. I'd really much rather sleep in and watch TV all day, right? Should I break my promise? The utilitarian might say yes. He says, well, add up the pain and pleasure, right? And if it turns out that your friend can easily find somebody else to move and you get much more pleasure out of staying home watching TV, then the utilitarian might say, sure, break the promise. Because again, utilitarians, everything is forward looking, stuff in the past doesn't really count. But what would Kant say? Well, Kant would say, ask yourself, what rule are you following? Well, the rule would be something like, it's okay to break promises if you don't feel like keeping. Now you have to ask yourself, could I make that a universal law that everyone followed? Right? And the important thing here is, I mean, that would be a bummer if, right, everyone broke their promises. But remember, Kant's not concerned about consequences, right? He's not worried whether it would be a kind of an ugly or unpleasant world if everyone broke their promises. He's wondering whether it's even possible, like rationally, or is it somehow incoherent? And arguably, um, you run into some kind of incoherence if you posit a world where everyone breaks their promises all the time, right? So if you think it through, if everyone breaks their promises all the time, no one's going to believe promises, right? And if no one believes promises, what's the point in promising in the first place, right? What you'll end up with is a world with no promises because they're totally useless. And now you're positing a world where everyone breaks promises, but there's no promises in the first place, and you can't break a promise if there's no promises. And now we have some kind of incoherence or contradiction, right? So this is what Kant thinks morality is, right? They're rational laws, and you can test something to see if it's moral by seeing if, when it's universal, does it break down into contradiction and incoherence? If it does, then it's immoral, right? If it doesn't, then it's moral. Okay, this is relatively short. I think there will be 3 lectures this week. I'm going to offer one on Course Guard, and then I'm also going to post one about how to write a philosophy paper. Uh, as many of you, I assume, probably have not done that before. And what I'm, what I want to get out of this class and the way I design the class is that you write a paper that's a bit better than you may be used to in your other classes, right? You're not being asked to summarize course content. Um, it's the kind of paper that, I'm not accusing anyone of using AI, but like it's the kind of paper that AI can't write. It's the kind of paper that only a human, right, that's practicing and doing a little philosophy can write, in that you're going to come up with original ideas and develop that. And as doing that, in my experience, is new to some people. And so I'm going to post a little lecture, hopefully details a bit of what that's going to look like for you, strategy to approach that if you've never quite done it before. So look out for 2 more lectures this week, and I will see you then.